Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways Real Loco Profile, where we look at some of the most famous locomotives to ever run in the UK and the models that they have inspired too. This morning, we're looking at the Southern Railway Schools Class 440 locomotive, the most powerful 440 design in Britain, designed in the late 1920s and really changed the face of the Southern Railway in the 1930s. So we're going to be looking at the history of the real-life locomotives, the models in double O gauge and N gauge that are available to order right now. And as ever, if you have any questions regarding the locomotives or the models of them, please do ask them in the chat and I'll be more than happy to answer them throughout the stream. Otherwise, let's get started. And as ever with a real railway profile, we have to go back a little bit before the introduction of the schools locomotives to understand why they were constructed. And the Southern Railway had really launched into a lot of new locomotive designs since 1923. We had the King Arthurs, we have the Lord Nelsons, and these are really taking over some of the express passenger duties which ran along the lines in the south and the southeast of England. However, there really was a need for a secondary design too, a lighter, smaller locomotive that could handle some of the secondary duties that the King Arthurs and the Lord Nelsons were too large for. There were a couple of designs on the scene at this time, but they weren't too successful, unfortunately. Maunsell had decided to rebuild the L class into the L1, but these were known as poor steamers. And then the Forts switched to building 264 tank engine locomotives. However, the design that we ended up with was this, a 440 locomotive, quite a rare wheel arrangement to develop at this time, actually. Not a lot of locomotives being built to the 440 style, a lot of locomotives being built as 460s or different wheel arrangements. But as you can see, this borrowed a lot from the other designs out there at the time. So you can see the heritage of the King Arthurs, Lord Nelsons, F-15s and other Maunsell designs going into the schools class that you see here. This was really influenced by these locomotives, and the first 10 were ordered in 1928, so just after the introduction of the Lord Nelson locomotives. It's not known whether it was the intention, but they were built to a slightly smaller physical size so they could handle the tight curves and some of the tight infrastructure on the Hastings route. It's not known whether this is part of the design or just a lucky coincidence, but the locomotives were well known for being introduced onto the Hastings line and transforming the services that ran here. They are quite different from a lot of other 440s on the network. They do have 3 cylinders rather than 2, and they were actually more powerful than the King Arthur locomotives that were larger. The only thing is they didn't quite achieve that lighter weight that they wanted. They did have a higher route availability than the King Arthurs, so some of the infrastructure, especially on the Hastings route, had to be upgraded so they could handle these heavier locomotives. But that happened in the late 1920s, and the locomotives were then let loose on the line to Hastings and a few more besides. All of the locomotives were built at Eastleigh Works by the Southern Railway. They were all ordered and delivered from there. There was 10 ordered in 1928, as we mentioned, with a further 20 ordered in 1931. 20 more were ordered in 1932, but this was cut back to 10, and they were delivered by 1935. So in the end, we had 40 of these locomotives built for the Southern Railway over a 5-year period. The name schools comes from that most, if not all, of the locomotives were named after famous boarding schools and other schools across the UK, starting off in the southern region, but then extending out to other parts of the UK too. It was common for the locomotives to be transferred to the nearest station to the school for their naming ceremony, and a lot of the schools still have copies or originals of the nameplates carried by the locomotives to this day. So you may have seen some out there on your travels, certainly, or in a couple of museums out there too. So the design was immediately successful. It was exactly what the Southern Railway had wanted in a lighter secondary locomotive, still capable of a good turn of speed and a high tractive effort, higher than the King Arthurs that we mentioned, but not made for the absolute top link duties, although they did end up on some of the express services into the southeast of England in the 1930s to destinations such as Margate, Ramsgate, and of course the Channel ports too. There was some modifications carried out over the years. The first 10, as you can see here in the Hornby model to my left, were delivered without smoke deflectors, but that was changed very quickly, with the locomotives receiving these a year after construction in 1931, and all the subsequent builds of the locomotives did have the smoke deflectors, which immeasurably improved the flow of steam over the cab, so the drivers could see a lot better. A further improvement was attempted by Oliver Bulleid in the 1940s. He'd improved the chimneys on his Lord Nelson locomotives with the Lemper exhaust, which was designed to bring the steam through a lot more and improve steaming. That really worked on the Lord Nelsons, and it was trialled on these locomotives too. However, not a huge difference was seen, really. They were quite good performers beforehand, and with the exhaust, a little bit better, but not quite worth the expense of carrying that out. Certainly in the Second World War era, where time and money was critical for other things at the time. So 20 of the locomotives were modified with those wider chimneys, but not all of the fleet, and it wasn't seen as an essential crossover. The main thing that changed in this time was the colour schemes. The locos had been introduced in the Monsal olive green, and it carried that for around 15 or so years now. However, in wartime, the sunshine livery came through, that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with out there. And then this came in towards the middle of the war with the locomotives painted into black, and then further locomotives were painted into the sunshine malachite green after the war too. But the locos still remained on those secondary express duties running throughout the south and the southeast of England, sometimes paired up with some older rolling stock, as you can see here, paired up with some SECR style bogie coaches running there on a secondary duty in the south of England. So now they were coming into the BR days. The transfer of the Southern Railway to the British Railway system in 1948 was afoot. The livery really made a change here, as the locomotives remained black, but they did get the full lining of British Rail. All the locomotives were treated in this livery, and they started to expand on their duties a little bit too. The reputation of the schools had started to spread, not only across the southern region, but onto other areas of British Rail too. So they had picked up a couple of other duties. They started working on cross-country duties, sometimes heading off the southern region to rare destinations such as Cardiff, although they did stick to that south and southeast region that they were known for. One interesting thing about the schools is they really seem to have picked up a lot of the Royal Train duties, certainly throughout the 1950s, with a lot of locomotives specially polished and painted for the occasion, with the symbolic 4-disc head code seen here for the Royal Train locomotives. So it seems to be a certain schools thing there. I'm not quite sure why the schools picked this up more than a lot of locomotives. Maybe you do know though. So if you do, let us know in the chat. But the schools remain completely successful at their task. However, their task was starting to disappear at this time, with the Kent Coast Electrification Programme restarted after a halt during the Second World War. This was started in the mid-1950s with the aim of electrifying more of the rail network where the schools made its home. The introduction of the Class 201 thumper units for the Hastings Route 2 really saw the final days of these locomotives, with them being purged from the parts of the network that they did run on. They did still get out there quite a bit, but they really were falling from their main duties, and there just wasn't quite as much for them to run on out there, really. So withdrawal was rather swift. The first locomotives were withdrawn in 1961, and they had all gone by the end of 1962. So they really didn't hang around getting rid of the schools locomotives, as you'll find with a lot of similar designs, with the King Arthurs and the Lord Nelsons having a comparatively brisk withdrawal period too. But that's not where the school's story ends. And it does have a little bit of an interesting twist here, because we've got 3 preserved locomotives, all with very different histories. The first, number 928, Stowe, has a relatively plain preservation life, really. It was at a few sites during the late 1960s, then arrived at the Bluebell Railway in the 1970s, where it has worked in preservation, and currently it is on display there. So a fairly standard life for this locomotive in preservation. The next locomotive then was number 925, Cheltenham. This was designated for the National Collection, but it never really had a home. It was quite a nomad during the 60s, 70s, and the 80s too. It was transferred between a lot of different sites in as withdrawn condition. It hadn't received any paint at all since it was withdrawn from service in 1962. This is at Dinting, which is in Cheshire in the north of England, but it was transferred between quite a few different sites, finally finding a home in the National Railway Museum itself in the 1990s. A campaign to get the locomotive running again was formed, and Cheltenham is still in service now. It's currently in BR green livery, but it did carry the post-war malachite green livery that you see here at the Gloucester-Warwickshire Railway. So this National Collection locomotive can be seen out there. I believe it's at the Mid-Hants Railway at the moment, but it is out there for all of you to see. Now, we've come to the last locomotive, Repton. This is the third and final locomotive from the class to be preserved, and this really did have an unusual history. In 1964, it was prepared for export. It actually travelled to America and was based at the Steamtown Museum, originally for display, and it was kept in its original condition, but in the early 1970s, it was restored to service. Now, those of you from America or fans of American railroad history will know that there's a lot of incompatibilities between the UK and the US systems. And of course, the modifications were carried out to Repton at this time. This is going to be one of the most unusual guises ever carried by a schools class locomotive. But you can see here some of the differences, including the American style headlight, the knuckle coupling, the cowcatcher, the air brake pipes. And finally, towards the back, you can see that the tender's been extended for full capacity there too when working in America. So this locomotive ran in the States from 1970s until the late 1980s, when a bid to bring it back to the UK was formed. And of course, that locomotive remains in service today, based at the North Yorkshire Moors Railway and back in a more traditional appearance, but it has retained that taller tender, which is the only one of its class to carry this style. So some really unusual locomotives there that you can see, and some of the unusual history of these locomotives. But it's great to still have three, all of which that have worked in preservation, and two of which at the time of recording you can still see out there on the UK's railways too. So, quick look at the models they've inspired, and you've got models available in double O gauge and N gauge too. Originally, Hornby brought out a model in the 1980s, which was a tender drive locomotive with non-NEM couplings, but still a nice amount of detail there. And this has transferred through into Hornby's railroad range. You still can get this model. It's now got a 5-pole motor in the front of the locomotive and an 8-pin digital ready socket in there too. So that's a really good locomotive if you're heading into the market for a schools, but you're looking for a good locomotive on a budget. Most of the locos I've got in front of me here are Hornby's Super Detail schools locomotive, released originally in the mid-2000s, and this has come through in many different guises carried by the class throughout their whole lives. Hornby has tooled up for pretty much every major detailing difference in the class. We can see here number 903 in the original condition of the locomotives. But in front of me, I've got locos with the modified chimneys and the smoke deflectors that we mentioned. There's even been locomotives released with the 8-wheel tender that the schools class occasionally ran with, more well known for running with the Lord Nelson locomotives. So if you're looking for a super high detail schools class, have a look at this model. We have them available new right now, or we have even more of a selection available in our pre-owned listings. So check out those too. Finally, for you N-gauge modelers, we've got Dapol's model, which is still a relatively new model, first released about 3 or 4 years ago. Again, in a lot of different conditions and liveries for the class. You can get these with and without smoke deflectors and the various different chimneys on the locos. These have got a 6-pin digital socket in the tender, with the motor in the tender connecting to the drive in the locomotive. You've got full NEM couplings, and certainly for N-gauge, you've got a huge wealth of detail there too. You've got a lot of separately fitted parts and the etched nameplates in the locomotive. So these are available to pre-order at the time of recording. We do have a short a small amount of these available in our pre-owned selection from the first batch, but a second batch is on the way, due early in 2021 in a variety of different liveries. And as ever, check out that link in the description for more information on all the models we have available. I've put a link in there for every single schools we can provide you, whether it's double O gauge or N gauge at the moment. For you O-gauge modelers, there's never been a ready-to-run model of the schools made available, but very occasionally we do receive kit-built locomotives into our pre-owned department, and these really do look the business too. So it is a very occasional thing, I will be honest with you, but do keep an eye out on our pre-owned listings, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see a schools on there one day, or we may indeed see a ready-to-run model produced in O-gauge. Who knows, it may be something we see in the future. But I think it deserves that model. I think it deserves every single model we've got here in front of us. These are a little bit of an interesting locomotive, designed when no other 440 locomotives were being built. It is the ultimate 440 design. You really see these on old-fashioned looking locomotives, but this still shows that 1930s technology coming through with a lot of modern features, such as the 3 cylinders there, and a lot of modifications carried out on the locomotives during their lives to improve the performance, which they were highly regarded for by crews, locomotive staff and enthusiasts, both in the original lives and of course in preservation too. They've got a really interesting history. You can run them on a variety of different vehicles and duties. With them being secondary locomotives, you can pair them up with some older rolling stock, as you see here, but they do also end up on the prestigious trains such as the Royal trains. And finally, as we mentioned before, if you're a modeler of the US railroad system, you can buy a schools. If you wanted to modify it to run on your American layout, one did make it over to America with some changes and perform part of the US railway history too. And there's not many locos that can fill that gap. Certainly there are 440s. So I really do recommend taking a further look at the schools, study a little bit more into those locomotives in preservation, and do keep an eye on the models that we have available either right now or are available for pre-order coming out in the very near future. So check out that link in the description for more information on the schools class models we have available right now. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed today's video and learned a little bit more about these fascinating locomotives. If you've got any further questions or you'd like to learn even more, don't hesitate to get in touch with our customer experience team or leave a comment on the video, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Facebook page for more real railway profiles, for more model railway skills cast videos, and all the latest model railway news too. Otherwise, I'll let you have a look again through some of those images. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.